So I recently mastered a hard techno EP that went straight to #1 on Beatport. The surprising thing is that the artist is completely new. He's a member of our coaching program. He's called Val C, and he released the Satire EP on a really small label. Now, today I want to take you behind the scenes of what actually happened in that mastering session, what I think about the original sound and what we created in the master, and then we'll try to match the original master that I created in my Wavelab mastering DAW with just the stock tools in Ableton. If you don't know me yet, my name is Philip from Pick Yourself. I produce, mix and master music professionally for over 15 years. I do it full time. I'm also a coach and mentor to other artists and producers who want to get better with their craft, finish music consistently. And if that's interesting to you, make sure to check out the link in the description. Now let's get into the tutorial. Okay, so what you're seeing here is the original session in Wavelab. Wavelab is my mastering DAW. Don't worry, we'll jump into Ableton in a minute. But I just wanted to show you the original session where this comes from. Unfortunately, I cannot play the audio because for whatever reason, it doesn't capture the 96K output here into my recording software. I have no idea why, and I don't want to mess with this right now. This is basically the sound that you would hear in the final release. And I just want to walk you through the mastering chain, what actually happened here behind the scenes. So 3 tracks. Pink Glasses, Corporate, and Gym Bro. I want to inform you that behind the scenes, those 2 tracks stayed exactly the same. The Gym Bro, I actually had a comment that I sent to Val because I noticed that the track itself was already quite distorted in the low end. So you had a lot of saturation on the kick and the bass. And that is a little secret I maybe can share with you. So if you're producing hard techno and you're just distorting the hell out of every single sound, the mastering engineer will actually not be able to create such a loud master, because if it's already so distorted in the lower end, when you then start to push it heavily into clippers and limiters and maybe try to add more saturation, it's just starting to sound much worse and all the impact will get lost. So that's a little trick that I want to share with you. Make sure to be really intentional with what elements you want to distort and how much in your production, and maybe keep it a tiny bit cleaner, because then the mastering engineer in the end can push it a bit more heavily. So the track that we will work on today, later on in Ableton, will be Pink Glasses. This is kind of the smash hit of this EP. It's an incredible, great sounding track, and this is the mastering chain that I've put together. Here, as you can see, first of all, I start with an infrasonic filter here. Now, I would say in like somewhere between 20 and 30% of mastering sessions, I actually have to shape the low end. Here you can see like it's set at 27 Hertz, so really far down and only with a gentle slope. So this is basically, let me just play this. You will not be able to hear this, but you can still visually see it. So it's just shaving off a tiny bit here. Now, a lot of people tell you that, yeah, in mastering, you only use low shelf filters and not high pass filters. In my experience, sometimes it's better, sometimes it's not better. I listen to this, I compare the two, and I just use what sounds better, even if this introduces like a slight phase shift, but that doesn't mean it's not going to work. After this, I go into a clipper. Now let's maybe pick a particularly loud section. Yeah, we're in the drop anyway, so let's play this and see how much we're clipping. So you can see between 1 and 4 dB is like what is being clipped, with stuff that is really dense and really loud, and there's a lot of stuff happening. You can get away with a bit more clipping sometimes, especially if it's very transient heavy. If clipping starts to sound bad, I just don't do it. Like in many sessions these days, I just don't use clipping at all, because once I start to hear the distortion from the clipper, that is a signal to me that I'm either overdoing it or I maybe shouldn't do it at all. And that's fine. That's fine. We don't always have to use clipping just because it's quite en vogue right now to talk about clipping. Let's go into the next one, the Kirchhoff EQ. That was still the main EQ in my mastering setup from last year. And as you can see, sometimes mastering engineers don't do that much. I slightly boosted something around 2K, I slightly lift the very top end at around 20K, and that is it for this particular EQ. Then this is not activated here. This is a mid-side EQ that I sometimes engage. Here, the panorama was perfect. I didn't mess with it at all. And we go into the Kotelnikov compressor. As you can see, like this is not even shaving off half a dB. It's very gentle. I also engaged the low frequency relax, which means that the very low frequencies will not trigger the detection circuit of the compressor as much. I made a video specifically about the Kotelnikov compressor and like these types of settings. Relatively slow attack time, relatively fast release time, gentle ratio like 1.5 to 1. This is like my standard mastering starting point ratio. I sometimes go down to 1.2 to 1. Maybe I might go up to 1.8 to 1. But yeah, that's about it. Then we follow this up with the shadow Hills compressor. Sometimes this to me introduces too much of a dark box tone onto the music. These days I use this mainly with tracks that overall are sounding quite bright. It does not sound as great with stuff that is already carrying a lot of low mid-range. Then it starts to, I don't know, sound like a bit weak. So I can also play this. As you can see, like super little compression going on here. Then this second EQ that I sometimes use to, after the compression, once again push something, it's not activated. TDR ultrasonic is like a low pass filter. This is especially relevant if you use nonlinear processing afterwards. For example, the Oven is the distortion plugin or saturation plugin that I use afterwards. And this is working a bit more. So as you can see, like on the EQ, I didn't do that much, but sometimes I use the saturator as a way of EQing things. It's just a different sound that you're adding. So you're adding a couple of overtones, and the Oven allows me to pretty precisely dial in, for example, a bit more saturation on the high mids or on the top end, or the sizzle function that I've also talked about in another mastering video. Something that I like a lot. And let's play this here. And you notice it's like already quite heavily pushed. So I try to always take down the output to overall match what's going into the signal and what's going out so that I'm not getting tricked. Gain staging is very important, but I also have to admit, like sometimes I'm in the flow and I'm just mastering and it's not correct to the point of a decibel. All right, and then we go into the FabFilter Pro L2. This is like my main loudness limiter in the end that pushes everything. Yeah, so as you can see, it's taking off 3-4 dB, which is still like quite conservative, I would say. I like this modern algorithm in 90% of the cases. So every mastering engineer has their own like preference. I like this one quite a lot. Sometimes I also like the aggressive one, especially on material that is very transient heavy. I might sometimes also use the transparent one, but with music that is like heavily pushed, I don't feel like it's working that well. After that, I just have a final true peak limiter. This doesn't do anything except like shaving off the intersample peaks at -0.1. This is like my final output ceiling that I use. The Pro L2 also has like a true peak functionality built in. I just did some A/B tests, and in my personal preference, this one sounded a bit better for this specific use case of just catching the intersample peaks. It doesn't make that much of a difference, to be honest. So you could also just use the true peak function of the L2. I mean, I'm working in 96 kilohertz anyway, so there's a high chance that the limiter already catches quite a few of the peaks that would otherwise on lower sample rates be intersample peaks. And I'm also oversampling this. So theoretically, there should not be too much to be caught afterwards. So yeah, that is the setup here. I'm sorry that I cannot play this right now. I don't know what's going on here. But once we are in Ableton, we will actually use the exported file of this song and then try to match it with just an Ableton only mastering chain. And we'll see how that goes. I have no idea. I have not tried it yet. Okay, so here we are in Ableton. We look at the mastered version up here. That is the red one. This is the master that I've created in Wavelab. I just pulled the export into this project here. And then the green one is what we will work on right now in Ableton. And we will try to get as close as possible to the original version. If it's not 100% matching, no worries. It can still sound great. So I'm sure we can get to the ballpark area of where this is. So the green one sounds like this. This is the mix that the artist has sent to me. And the master sounds like this. Okay, let's get started. Step number one in my mastering process is to have a limiter already engaged. This is obviously the last part in the chain, but we'll put it in here. And Ableton thankfully finally updated the limiter since the last mastering video that I did. And this is actually sounding pretty good, the new one. I like it a lot. I would adjust the ceiling to -0.1. In most cases, that's enough of like a safety margin. I would say like more traditional mastering engineers consider -0.3 or -0.4 like a good range. And yeah, if you want to be extremely precise and clean, then yes, do that. More power to you. Some people even say go as low as -1 dB true peak. I personally leave it like this, and a lot of my colleagues also are in that range. What I would adjust here as like a standard setting is I would bring the release time down quite a bit, especially with like faster electronic music, because a release time of 100 milliseconds or even higher, this can sometimes cause the limiter to just sound like a bit unnatural and start like influencing the groove of the music too much, because yeah, it just takes a bit more time until the limiter reaches its natural state. So I would bring it down And like a starting point that I often use is between like 7 milliseconds and 18 milliseconds, somewhere in that range. This link setting is basically the two channels, the left and the right, can be limited independently from one another. So the detection circuit is basically listening now to both at the same time. You can unlink them a little bit. And this sometimes can give you more potential for loudness. So you can push it a bit harder, but also it increases the level of distortion very often. And it sometimes also can smear the stereo spectrum a little bit. So it just sounds weird sometimes. And for club music, even though a lot of mastering engineers go for maximum loudness and basically unlink them completely, I personally think that that's a bad idea. I keep it close to the 100% in most cases. And then we can see, like, can we bring it down or not without consequences? Because I like the stereo image to be really stable. And I also don't want any like distortion sounds coming only from the left or only from the right. I think that's just a bit weird. Yeah, for the limiting mode, if you want to do like a clean master, you can go to true peak. Standard would just allow intersample peaks from happening. So intersample peaks are peaks that happen between one sampling point and the next one. So at lower sampling rates, like 44.1, for example, it can happen that there's like a peak actually happening in the signal in between those 2 points. If you're working at higher sample rates, it's usually not that much of an issue. But here we are right now in 48 kilohertz. That's like a pretty standard way of working. So 44.1 or 48 kilohertz. So I just basically put myself into the position of the typical producer engineer who might be watching this. So I would go for the true peak setting to be quite safe. Let's now see the look ahead. For loudness, definitely keep the look ahead short. If you want to be extremely safe and just have no peaks at all, go for something longer. But typically, the better sound you will definitely get from this. Okay, let's listen to this and just see in general how far can we push the original mix now. Right, so I've adjusted this now. I'm pushing this 10 dB just to see if we can get into the ballpark region of the original master. Let's just flip back and forth. So we're actually quite close in terms of loudness. It's still a bit quieter, but that also has to do with the overall balance and what is happening in the other master overall. So let's see what we can do from now. So we work backwards now. So we have the final limiter, and now we'll go to the beginning of the chain. My recommendation, if you're inexperienced with mastering, you're just like starting out mastering your own music, I would do as minimal of a mastering chain as possible. So just don't go crazy. Don't use like a 10 plugin chain. Start with the most basic stuff and then basically you're sorted. So we will just insert an EQ first of all. So here we have the EQ8, and in the original master I had like a tiny bit of a low cut filter, really gentle. Let's see if that sounds good here. Now obviously what you can see here is the shape of the filter is not super fine adjustable here. Yeah, so you have obviously like a more aggressive one and you have a more gentle one, but there's like no fluid way of adjusting this. With our original mastering chain, we had the possibility to dial in exactly the sweet spot. This is not possible here. You can change the Q factor, of course. That helps also a little bit. Yeah, but still it's a bit different. So let's check this out. So I get a tiny bit cleaner low end like this. I would still say maybe here, since this is not so fine adjustable, I would actually try to do it with the low shelf instead, which very often is a good idea in mastering because it minimizes the phase shift that's being introduced. So the whole idea why I'm doing this is that I think there is a tiny bit excessive sub low end here, which obviously takes away from the overall headroom that we have available here. So I think the limiter can work a tiny bit cleaner overall in these levels of loudness if we take away a tiny bit here in the very low end. I think this sounded better than the original filter. Still, to be very honest with you, I think the original master, it just felt like a bit more dialed in when I did this with the infrasonic filter by TDR. But that is like the 0.01% like quality difference that we're talking about, so don't worry. You can still do this with Ableton and get to great results, so we'll get pretty close to the original master, I'm sure. I think a tiny bit of opening up in the upper mid-range and in the very top end is definitely necessary here. Let's see what we can do. So I don't like high shelves filter that much in the very top end because to me it's not precise enough. I really like to do this in a more gentle way. You can also do like a bell curve and then just make the bell shape like a bit broader so that it's closer to a high shelf. I personally just like the sound of that a bit more. And as you can see here, what I've boosted here is a bit of upper mid-range, so in the like 2.6K region. Just this gave me a bit more focus on the sound. It's like really hitting me in the face in a really pleasant way and something that I think is important with hard techno. Now let's talk about the very top end. What I'm trying to do here is I just try to open up the top end a tiny bit. It sounds just a bit more hi-fi is like a strange word in hard techno, but yeah, I definitely think it enhances the overall fidelity of the sound. If I had to point my finger at specific sounds, I think the cymbals definitely benefit from this, but also some of the room sounds just start to become a bit more apparent. Now, obviously, you have to bring down the gain of the EQ a tiny bit to match the boosts that we've done here. So you flip it on and off. Tiny bit too bright, so this is why I'm talking about these like super minimalist things you need to do in mastering. Obviously your ear needs to be trained a bit to hear the difference between like 0.5 decibels, but overall these changes, like taking this down, boosting these a tiny bit, this definitely makes a difference. I'm just playing this once again for you, and try to focus, try to close your eyes, focus on the sounds you hear. What I get from this is just a tiny bit more presence and clarity and focus on the music. That's what I'm listening to right now. Now, interestingly, in the original master, I did not have to push anything in the low end here, so where the punch of the kick is sitting. I feel like in this Ableton version, and I cannot tell you why exactly it is, but I feel like I want to boost a tiny bit here. Let's see where we find the sweet spot. So in the low end, it's always important to just not have too narrow of a cue. It starts to sound very weird if you're just boosting individual low end frequencies because single notes start to stand out. It's always better to have it like a bit broader, but if you're too broad, it starts to get muddy. So I always try to find that sweet spot. And now what we're trying to find is basically the impact of the kick drum. Very nice. Okay. Now, without the EQ and then with. And once again, we have to gain stage a little bit. Bring this down here. Yeah, now we have to focus in the mid-range, we have to focus in the top end, and we also have the focus happening in the low end. This is exactly what I wanted. It already sounds quite good, so even like this, you could print a master out of that. It would not sound bad at all. But let's see if we can push it a bit more, and I would go for a glue compressor next. So as you can see, I'm like literally not using any clip or anything right now. I don't think it's necessary here for this master. So let's keep it a bit more minimalist. So slow attack time, fast release time, and the ratio for these types of mastering applications, I would leave this as 2:1, not higher than that. That is the way to go. What you can also do is you can activate filter here to filter out some of the low end of the detection circuit so that the compressor mainly reacts to the body of the music and not so much to just the low end, because obviously the low end is quite massive in techno music and you don't want the kick and the bass to just trigger this compressor like crazy, because that would introduce a bit more of a pumping sound. Yeah, this really brings the percussions to life. That's a typical effect that you get from a glue compressor somehow, especially heads, shakers, claps, stuff like that. It starts to feel more cohesive, but at the same time a bit more lively. That is what a glue compressor is really good at. So once again, without and then with. Okay, great. Now, basically what, in my opinion, is still missing is a tiny bit of saturation that we can put on here. So let's try out raw and see if we can just saturate some of the high mids, some of the top end maybe. We'll see. So my tool of choice that I've inserted here is raw in multiband mode. So you can hear, you can change the modes from single to serial and so on to multiband. In this case, if you just want to push certain frequencies inside your overall musical bands, you want to saturate in multiband mode. In this specific case, mainly the mid and the high frequencies, because if you push the low frequencies a bit too much and you saturate them a lot, kick drum and bass start to get weak. And this is something, like, this is the last thing we want with techno music. I would maybe very gently play around with this, but overall I don't think it's a great idea. So let's see what we can do. Push the drive a bit. Obviously, this compression here is something that I would not use, and I also have to adjust the output. It's not ideal as a mastering tool, but it definitely works. I'm personally overall more used to my normal mastering tools, so I'm trying to mimic some of the behavior that I know from the oven. But here, let's try this out with and without. Yeah, so raw is pretty aggressive actually. I have to tone this down a tiny bit. So let's bring this down, and I will try a tiny bit of that low frequency saturation as well. Just the output once again. So if you push this too hard, obviously it's pushing also more into the limiter, which then distorts even more. You have to be really, really careful with your settings. I like this tone handle a lot, because if you notice that overall something's too bright or too dark, you can just quickly adjust this on the fly. So it just sounds a tiny bit fuller, a tiny bit like the overtones are filling the gaps in this frequency spectrum. It's super subtle overall. Still, if you overdo this, it can sound super thin immediately. So I would be really careful with raw. If you're very inexperienced to mixing and mastering, don't use a complex tool like raw right away. Use something like normal Ableton saturator, push that a tiny bit, and see if that does the trick. Now we're overall pretty close to the final result, I would say. Let's just compare our other master with this one. So first of all, I'm going to play the Ableton master, and then I'm going to play the original master that we've created. Let me just close this so we see what we're playing. So right now, Ableton master, then the other one. Okay, so what we can still hear is a little bit of a difference. First of all, the other one is still louder. Yeah, and the thing is, I was only taking away like 3-4 dB on the final limiter on the original master. But here, as you can see in the Ableton limiter, let me just quickly go here so you see it. We're already taking about like 7.8. But there's maybe one peak when I pushed something. But I see we can still push it a little bit here. Now here it starts to fall apart, like I would never push it more than that. This is already at the edge of acceptable. You can then see if you play around with the link settings, with the release, if you can get it to sound a bit more clean or a bit more loud. So shorter release times on a limiter sound even louder, but they also increase distortion. And so longer release times are a bit cleaner. The sweet spot here is around like 9 or 10. I can show you what happens when I push this even further. This is when you will notice that the low end starts to just collapse. So this is when it like literally starts to shred the low end. Okay, so it's getting closer, but there is a difference not only in the loudness, there's also a difference in frequency spectrum. So I feel that our Ableton master is still a bit more on the bright side, and we might want to get a tiny bit more low mid-range into the mix overall. Let's see if we can handle this with an EQ, or if you want to handle it in a different way. Maybe we can insert another band that just deals with this right away. Okay, let's try this again. Yeah, okay, so the difference now becomes more and more tiny. I would say this is like a great result overall for an Ableton only master. To be honest with you, it's always important to know your tools well. So I'm just much more familiar mastering with my mastering tools that I always use. But if you forced me to just master with Ableton tools for like a month, then for sure I could get to very, very similar results, especially with this new limiter. The one thing that I would say is still a bit tricky in Ableton is that everything in terms of the GUI, it feels very fiddly. So it's nice for just creatively patching stuff together, and I love Ableton as a DAW. But for mastering, yeah, it just feels a bit difficult to just reach the right settings and go for everything in detail. But yeah, apart from that, I think the sonic result speaks for itself. It sounds great. I hope you got a lot of value from that video. Let me know in the comments, and I'll catch you in the next one.